everybody. Good afternoon and welcome to the fifth of our 2021 dialogues. My name is Tom Dennis and I'm the CEO of Serenity and Leadership, which is a culture change consultancy and training organization. I'd like to introduce Stacy. Stacy is the director of Inner Circle's educational psychology. After many years of supporting child and adult well-being through training, consultation and supervision, on her second maternity leave, she founded The Nesting Coach, calling on her experience and expertise to support the emotional health and well-being of women transitioning into motherhood. The Nesting Coach provides psychoeducation, coaching, and reflective space for women during matrescence. Now, if you've never heard of the term matrescence, it's something that was coined by the anthropologist Dana Raphael, and it's defined as the process of becoming a mother. It's a word used to describe the physical, psychological, and emotional changes people go through during the monumental transformation that is motherhood. Stacy is a mother of two and brings her own personal experience as well as the 15 years she spent as a chartered psychologist. So we're really looking forward to what you have to say, Stacy. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Tom. That was a really lovely introduction. Thank you. I think it's really important that we acknowledge all of the various aspects of our identities, and I'll go on to some of that in the conversation today. Okay, so yeah, what are we saying behind her back? And it's a provocative title, obviously, but it's really about the importance of narratives. Today is all about establishing why narratives matter in the first place. There's something about intersectionality and the fact that all of our identities come to work with us, and there may be increased vulnerabilities for some people who have particular identities than others. And for us to hold in mind all of these things, to consider how we think, feel, and what we say about people who are going through matrescence or becoming parents. And then I really want us to explore some of the prevalent narratives, some that may well be quite helpful, some that may be quite unhelpful. And then finally get to the point of thinking about what are some of the more inclusive approaches that we can have or can take to considering how we speak and how we think and feel about people who are going through matrescence or maternity leave. So to go further then, so who am I, first of all? I think it's important for not only Tom to have introduced me, but in terms of exploring what the various facets of identity are, to name all of the various things that are important to me. So I run the company Inner Circles. I'm connected with UCL, the university. I'm a chartered psychologist of the BPS. I run something called the Nesting Coach, which supports women in their journeys through matrescence. And then there's a photo of my family, because ultimately, when we are stepping into matrescence or when we become pregnant in the workplace, there's this instant exposure to things that are otherwise quite private. They're suddenly coming to the fore in the workplace, whereas they haven't had to before. So I think it's important to include this, because really what we're looking for in our workplaces are places where we can be as authentic as possible, where every single part of our identity can show up authentically. Or if we have to put down part of our identity, it isn't at much cost. So the fact that you may like to juggle, not metaphorically, literally, clown skills might be something that you're really interested in. The fact you can't do that in the workplace may not be a huge hindrance to you. But the fact that you have an identity as a mother, and there are certain responsibilities that you can't necessarily put down as easily as those juggling batons or balls, we're thinking about organizations being able to really hold in mind people's core identities and values, and the things that are really important to them, that they are congruent with the workplaces that they're at. Intersectionality. It's something that we talk about a lot, that we mention when we're talking about inclusion and diversity. And it's really about where the roads meet. I see it for the purposes of this conversation about where our roads meet, where all of these areas of our identity meet. and how we are enabled to take our whole selves to work. What are the congruence in values between what you want to achieve as an individual and what is expected of you within the workplace? And where is your pathway going? There are some very unhelpful narratives that I will explore further in this conversation, that are quite loud voices that determine how people may feel about women or mothers returning to the workplace after having had a child. And those narratives may be about what her current ambitions are career-wise, what her priorities might be now. And it's quite surprising, some of the statistics that show up in some of the research that's happened. So I'll share some of that with you. What we do know from matrescence, and I think it's really important that we understand the normality of this, is that having a child is not a small feat. Having a child, literally growing a human and expelling it from your body, is physiologically a miracle. But all of the other additional things that we have to go through in terms of that shift and that adjustment need to be held in mind. And that huge life change, in the same way that other life changes happen, that huge life change causes something called cognitive dissonance. So this real, that meeting between what you expect to happen, what does happen, what you feel should happen, what you believe your values think should happen. And when we reach cognitive dissonance, and there's a lot of cognitive dissonance going on between our professional identities and identities as mothers, this is where we need our support to be really crucially targeted. And for that to be seen as normal is something that a workplace can really empower women to understand that that's normal, or they can actually try to avoid the conversations about this really pertinent transition that's going on. What we do know about intersectionality is that some employees may be more vulnerable to pregnancy and parenthood risks than others. Black women, we know, for example, are 5 times more likely to die in childbirth. We know that there are some groups that are more likely to be susceptible to mental ill health than others. There are some groups that are quite marginalized, such as the trans community, in having a baby. Again, even further marginalization can really impact negatively on mental health. So how can we hold this in mind as an organization to have more powerful, empowered, and less marginalizing conversations and narratives about becoming a parent? We know that the Equality Act exists. We also know that policies are a particular narrative, and they are a narrative that may well be heeded or not. The fact that we have to have a legal framework as opposed to the moral duty within a workplace suggests that there has been a long period of time where these very basic protected characteristics have not been upheld. We know this from the narratives of women. We know this from the stories of women. We know that it still, in 2021, seems quite unusual that women may want to have a child biologically. It shouldn't be. Where can we go, and how can we hold all of that in mind? I'm wondering if you're aware that pregnancy and maternity were a protected characteristic within the Equality Act. I'm assuming that most people know, some people don't. So just to highlight that to you. And also some other things that we know for sure. Women do actually make up almost half of the workforce in the UK. And we know that women and transgender men can become pregnant. What we also know is that pregnancy is not the only route to parenthood. We also know that about the impact on mental health. A statistic that not a lot of people know is that suicide is the most common cause of death in mothers with children under 1 year old in the UK. And knowing that statistic, that really sobering statistic, while there is a duty of care from employers to their employees, whether they are present in the office or on maternity leave or on any other type of leave, how are we stepping up as employers to uphold that duty of care, having known all of these statistics and some of them being quite sobering? Are you able as an employer to maintain your reputation as an organization that cares about their employees when they become parents? And how can you support that broader psychological transition? I want to just highlight something about narrative psychology, and this really informed the title of this talk. What are we saying behind their backs? And what are we saying to their faces, I suppose, as well, whether through words or through culture or through the unspoken. Narrative psychology is powerful. It's a way of us giving meaning to the experiences. It's a way of us shaping the memories of past events, what's going on in the present, and also what may well happen to us in the future. It allows people to define themselves as organizations, as individual employees who've gone away and become parents and come back, but also other employees who often have to take up the slack when an employee goes off for an extended period of time. So thinking about narrative, we know that, well, I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with this figure, but there was a study done by the Equality and the Equalities Commission, which showed that 54,000 people, if we scaled up from the 3,000 or so, it was 3,254 mothers that were interviewed, if we scaled up the results that came from this research, 54,000 women pregnant women were forced out of their jobs in 2015. And by forced out, it was made to feel very uncomfortable, that jobs may well have been deleted, that new standards came in, that women felt as though they had to leave their jobs, 54,000 of them. It is a huge number, but there is something positive to take from that figure, in that 1 in 9 working pregnant women felt this way, which meant 8 in 9 didn't. 8 in 9 were supported by their employers. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from such employers going forward. 1% of these women take their employers to tribunal, but we know that there are certain things that can facilitate the possibility of successfully taking an employer to tribunal, and other factors that can actually make it more difficult. The fact, for example, that it has to be within 3 months is very limiting to a lot of groups. And thinking about the intersectionality I mentioned before, there are certain groups who financially may well find it very difficult to fight. If you are experiencing mental ill health, quite severe mental ill health, you would not have the capacity to be able to challenge any decisions that have been taken in the workplace. So I think it's really crucial that we hold in mind when things go wrong and why things go wrong and how debilitating this is to women. But we also hold in mind the positive stories of organisations that do it right, that get it right, because it shows that it is possible. So we've got all these competing demands when women become mothers. We may well have a narrative of people saying to her face that, or behind her back, that you have this superwoman narrative of being able to have it all. There's the examples of people such as Nicola Horlick, the investment fund manager, who described raising 6 children and being very at the top of her game. But I think people often forget that there was a huge team supporting her to be able to do that. And she herself candidly shares the necessity of having had staff to support her. So we have this narrative of Nicola Horlick saying, you know, I needed the help, but the message of women being able to do it all and have it all is quite a loud message. And so when you yourself may not feel that you're able to do so as an employee, I suppose that creates that cognitive dissonance as well, as to why can't I? Where is the support for me to be able to do this? We may then have a manager who might bring her narratives of other and experiences of other women who have been on maternity leave and returned. You know, if they've been able to come back after 3, 4, 5, 6 months, why can't you? There are various levels of tolerance, benevolence, malevolence towards pregnancy. There is some empathy. There's also the narrative of the pressure from above, saying, you know, you're on maternity leave and we need to fill the role. Or we need to share your work between other people, and you coming back part-time and asking for flexible working, my hands are tied, I can't quite do this. So there are some really unhelpful narratives that can be shared with women to either facilitate or impede their return to the workplace. We may have the view of the lobbyists of the mothering being the most important role in the world, and you should ditch your career and focus on the baby and maybe a passion project if you so wish. But there's no real illustration, again, of that intersectionality of competing bills, so economic well-being, partners' views, the cultural expectations, or other competing responsibilities that the woman may have. And then, of course, we have a baby. We have a small child who has their demands and may well go through phases of needing to quite huge amounts of sleep deprivation on these individual women, causing such physical, physiological, and psychological shifts. And then, of course, we have the woman at the end of this who has all of these various things that they want to hold in mind, and they want to move back into the workplace potentially. So how can you do that when you are really holding in mind all of these competing narratives, as well as trying to keep hold of your own core identity and values? I'm going to move on to thinking about some of those commonly held beliefs. Some of these may surprise you, others may not, and I hope these will spark some of the conversation further in our dialogue. So a third of private sector employers agree that it's reasonable to ask women about their plans to have children in the future during the recruitment process. Even though this is highly illegal, a third think that that's okay. 6 in 10, so more than half, agree that a woman should have to disclose whether she's pregnant at the recruitment process. Again, illegal, but it's a commonly held narrative. And almost half think it's reasonable to ask if a woman has young children. Not necessarily men. I don't see that being that was not answered in the same way in this survey. Women were expected to be able to say if they had young children. So I think it's really crucial that we understand, if these narratives are held in mind, these are the discussions behind women's backs, and what's the impact in people's thoughts and behavior towards these women in going through matrescence, in itself a huge life journey. A third believe that a woman coming back to the workplace would be generally less interested in career progression. 4 in 10 think that pregnancy puts an unnecessary cost or burden on the workplace. I do wonder how we would move forward as a population if women stopped having children, but I guess it's something that, maybe there's another thing that I haven't thought of, but yeah, it's seen as a burden. And half agree that there is sometimes resentment amongst employees, and so the fact that the resentment is there, I don't think it's useful for us to say there shouldn't be resentment and there should be a joyful moving on, a persistent joyfulness among employees. I think there needs to be an exploration of why that is, what's leading to the resentment, and what we can do about it as an employer. So 5 narratives. So number 1, what systems within your organization support that transition for the mother? Expecting her to park her professional identity can really stir up feelings of grief and cognitive dissonance for a mother, especially if she has really held on to her professional identity as a core part of her identity. How can you respectfully help employees to retain a healthy sense of connectedness and professional identity? So that might be including her in some training. It might be asking her to collate something in terms of training materials before going on maternity leave that can really harness her expertise. It could be recognizing her contributions and within her performance management conversations or appraisals before she goes on maternity leave, really recognizing some of the excellent work that she has done before going on maternity leave, and thinking about, well, in a year's time or whenever you are coming back, how can we make sure that you continue this great work, and how can we continue your work when you are gone temporarily? There's a lot that needs to be held in mind in considering that transition, but organizationally, it's work that needs to be done in advance. The system of handover is one that is also something to hold in mind. Considering a 3-month handover, so for 3 months, really considering what is going to be the impact of her absence before she goes, and not necessarily just thinking about the attendance of the antenatal appointments on all of the HR tick box exercises. What is the loss of this person from this organization? what is this going to mean for us and what is this going to mean for her? Secondly, my business and your business. And I spoke earlier about this juxtaposition of reproductive identity coming into the fore for the first time. A very personal story is effectively held in mind within the workplace. So who is there in place in your organization? Not necessarily a line manager, but do you have access to other employees or external professionals who will be able to support somebody in considering when they share, who they share with, and what they share? We know that not everybody becomes a mother the same way, and people are curious. But how is that managed? How are those messages managed within the employee team? How can we ensure we're not being discriminatory in some of the comments that we may share, or things that we might say? And I know that there's a tendency to try to get it right, and so therefore there's an avoidance, but that in itself can be quite neglectful of the huge shift that's happening at the time. Thirdly, the team. I'm going to read this verbatim because I think it's important. So the construction of narratives about the employee are shaped by, and in turn, they shape the organizational culture. So before anybody even comes in pregnant, let's think about the culture. A culture that supports finger pointing and blame won't really ever transcend to the belief that an employee's pregnancy is anything other than a hindrance to the remaining team. So this is about the culture beforehand, before anybody announces that they're pregnant. It will never be reframed. A pregnancy will never be reframed as an opportunity for the organization to become more agile and responsive to real life. And without culture shift, the organization won't be in a position to welcome back to the fold that employee who is irreversibly altered with their additional set of parenting skills, which are incredibly enriching. We know that ability to multitask, that ability to understand time management, that ability to be resilient and actually perform while you have all of these competing demands is really kicked up a notch when women go into and become mothers. But what is the culture beforehand, and does it enable women to come in, to leave and come back to that, and for the team to hear managers talking from that position? We also know from a psychological perspective, when people leave, there is an inherent grieving process that happens within individuals and within teams. And so to expect, and not necessarily to shout down people who may feel quite angry about somebody leaving, who may feel quite bereft that somebody who may have been a manager or held them in mind has gone off and is having a baby. They're all natural parts of the process, and I don't think it's helpful to pathologize people's responses that may not be particularly joyful to someone going off and having a baby, but they do need to be managed. And the overall cultural message needs to be reinforced from the top down. That is, this is something expected, this is something normal, this is something that happens in everyday life, as opposed to a hindrance and, oh my goodness, we're going to have to backfill all of this work. We knew when we employed people, humans, that they will procreate. We knew this. And so the expectation that they may not, or that it's a surprise when any of them do, is particularly naive. Again, about the team, we need to anticipate that it is a transition. We need to acknowledge the impact on their roles and their responsibilities, and name rather than ignoring the dynamic shift, especially if there is somebody that's come in to cover maternity leave. That person has thoughts, feelings, and their own psychology too. How are they included temporarily in a team, respectfully, but still holding in mind that person who is still part of your team, although they're on maternity leave, but might not be present? When you have meetings, for example, if it is particularly around a topic that the person on maternity leave covers, how can that person's voice be held in mind? And it's about thinking about some creative ways, whether using reflective teams, for example, to name how that person may well respond to the decisions that have been made within meetings. Good endings promote better beginnings. We know this, that if we can think about how people are sent off and how people are existing without that employee being there, we know that that can either help or hinder the likelihood of there being a positive return to work. The conversations around when will you be back? Will you be back? Very inappropriate and also illegal. If we anticipate that 52 weeks is the length of time that a woman can be off work on maternity leave, use that as your benchmark, and then anything else is a bonus. If we go from that way round, hopefully we are being far more respectful that there is a transition that is built in and enshrined within law. I agree with how you're going to stay in touch. I think it's really important to consider organizational research. It may not be that it's the first person going off to maternity leave. How are you capturing the stories of people who do undergo this transition to be able to learn and better implement new ways of thinking for future within your organization? There's a lot of rich information that I think can often be lost, and a lot of narratives that end up on the Pregnant and Screwed website, for example, of people feeling hard done by, who have never had their voice heard around how they felt in going through maternity leave and how their employer could have done more. So make the time and work it within your policy as to how you capture the experiences of people who are going through the transition of maternity, as well as those who were the existing team while people went on maternity. Have they been able to speak their truth? Have they been able to hear their voice captured? And what have you learned from their experiences to then apply to the next person who may well go off on maternity leave? And then finally, I think COVID has taught us a lot. If there's something that we can definitely take from COVID, it's this idea of flexible working. And whereas in the past, lots of flexible working applications may well have been side-eyed or looked at with sheer trepidation of them never being done before, I think there is a window of us thinking, how can flexible working be worked in? Is it something that could be considered even before somebody comes back from maternity leave? Is it something that needs to be held in mind as a potential for all people, not just those who are going on maternity leave, but anybody who's going through a massive life change? What strengths-based approaches can we take to mental health? And what I mean by that is resilience. How have people managed to keep going? How have mothers managed to keep going despite potentially experiencing mental ill health associated with maternity, and how have they been able to hold in mind all of those aspects of their identity and then come back to the workplace? There's lots of transitions, and we know transition and change requires support. So how can we ensure that the strengths that have been shown are included in that transition back to the workplace? Transparency, not just with the employee, but with the other employees, the employee going on maternity leave, but with the other employees. What's the transparency with them about how the role is going to be backfilled? What's the transparency about the expectations within the team about what they have to do? What are the options moving forward when she comes back, and how can that be included? And then a final point, I think it's worth us considering reflective supervision. I know there's a lot of organisations, myself included, that talk about how we support people to think differently. And those offers often come in with some organisations providing their employees with 6 weeks of coaching when they go off into maternity leave, and then when they come back to really think through how to negotiate all of the various competing demands. But what sorts of reflective supervision are there for the remaining staff, for the remaining managers, to really manage this? I said earlier, it shouldn't be a surprise that people go off and have babies, but it still seems to be. But there's a real call to rethink the possibilities and enshrine those within policy, so that the narrative within the policy of your organization, the espoused theory, is definitely the theory in use, and there's not a difference between the two. I just include at the end some useful resources. The middle one, Pregnancy, Maternity and Returning to Work, is a handbook that was put together by Working Families and the National Childbirth Trust. And then the top one, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, if you are considering what employer support needs to be there, that's worthwhile checking out as well. Finally, the charities that I asked to be supported today by any of the donations that you made. Firstly, Pregnant and Screwed. If you're interested in some of those narratives, it's quite heartbreaking to read through some of them and how the next generation of our population are being brought into the world by mothers who have had to undergo not just that huge biological, psychological, emotional shift of becoming a mother themselves, but within their careers, their professional identity has had to undergo such a battering as well. It makes very, very sobering reading. And so Pregnant and Screwed is a very helpful organisation. And a small charity called Action on Postpartum Psychosis, and I think we're lucky enough to have Sally Wilson online today, who supports a very, very debilitating mental illness that affects 1 in 500 women, called postpartum psychosis. So just because somebody seems absolutely fine, goes off, has a great ending, and seems as though they're absolutely fine, it doesn't mean that they're any less likely to develop a mental ill health that's associated with motherhood. And so if you're interested in knowing more about postpartum psychosis, because it's a very little known mental illness, do get in touch with Sally, and also Action on Postpartum Psychosis. Thank you for your attention. And Tom, apologies for overrunning there.
Thank you very much indeed, Stacey. Thank you. I said to Stacey she could sum up. Please keep it very tight, Stacey.
I shall. Thank you so much for all of your attention, everybody, and your contributions. I think this has been a really rich discussion, and of course, obviously, we haven't solved everything. We haven't put the world to rights as such, but I hope it's given us some further food for thought. The word transparency, someone highlighted the word transparency, and that is a thread that I think I highlighted within the start within the talk. And I think transparency has to be purposeful. I think in encouraging people to share their narratives, in encouraging organizations to be transparent about what their narratives are, the culture of emotional safety needs to be in existence, and that takes time. So whereas, you know, one person, a woman may be asked, do you have children? And there's an implication as to why that question is being asked. If a man is asked that question, there should be similar expectations or reasons for that question being asked, but we know that's not true. And it's exactly the same with other areas of inclusion or difference. If someone asks where you're from, of one person who has an unusual last name or a non-British last name, is that question asked of somebody with a seemingly British last name, such as myself? I've turned up many times and surprised people with my appearance. So emotional safety to encourage storytelling is a very important part of this continuing dialogue, to ensure that assumptions are not made, and women who are going off to have children and come back to the workplace are a crucial part of the conversation, that they are not spoken about and spoken to, but included as part of the wider conversation as to what is required, what is possible, and what should happen to then feed back into the culture of the organisation. So ensuring that voices are heard and voices are given the place to be heard, not just by line managers, but by other supportive entities within companies, is incredibly important, so that while society may not be shifting at as great a speed as we would like, perhaps our organizations as our little microcosms may well continue to shift in the right direction towards greater equality in all areas of difference.
Stacey, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. It's been great to hear you. It's such an important subject, I think. If we, in our own little way, have tried to spread the conversation in some way, then, you know, share the video afterwards when we when we put it out there. Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's wonderful to see you. And please come back next time on the 17th of June, when Joanne will be talking about the language of inclusion. So farewell all, and thank you very much indeed.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.